If you ever find an old cassette tape in a dead person's house, do not press play. Not even once. Because some voices don't stay in the past. Some voices wait for you to listen, and then they learn your name. My name is Sarah. I am 26 years old. And 3 months ago, I found my mother's voice trapped inside a plastic box the size of my palm. I want to tell you exactly what happened in order, because if I don't say it out loud, I think it will happen again. I think saying it keeps me safe. For now. Please, just listen to the whole thing before you decide I'm crazy. By the end, I think you'll understand why I can't stop looking over my shoulder. Part 1. The empty house. My mother died in March. Cancer. Slow, then fast, the way the doctors always warn you it will be. I was with her at the end, holding her hand in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and flowers that were already dying in their vases. Her last words to me were soft, almost a whisper. She said, "Sarah, don't listen to anything that sounds like me if I'm not really there." Part 3. Something is different the next evening. I wanted to hear her voice again. I made tea, sat on the floor in the same spot, and pressed play, already smiling before the static even started, already bracing myself to cry the good kind of tears. The static came first, just like before. Then her voice. But something was wrong. "Sarah," the voice said. "My sweet girl, did you sleep well last night? You always used to toss and turn when you were anxious about something. I could always tell, even when you were a teenager and thought you were hiding it from me." I froze, my tea cooling in my hands. I had tossed and turned the night before. Actually, no, wait, I had fallen asleep on the floor, deeply, dreamlessly the best sleep I'd had in weeks. That didn't match. But more than that, the tape from the night before hadn't mentioned anything about sleep at all. It had talked about my birth, about my father, about hoping I found someone to love me. This was a different conversation entirely, a new one, layered on top of the old one like a second coat of paint. I told myself I was misremembering. Grief does strange things to memory. Maybe I had just forgotten a section. Maybe the tape was longer than I thought, and I hadn't listened all the way through the first time, and this was simply a part one had missed. The voice continued. "I know you found the wooden box in the attic. I know you drove to 3 stores looking for something to play me on. You always were stubborn like that. Even as a little girl, remember the time you refused to wear a coat in the snow because you wanted to prove you weren't cold? Do you remember the blue dress you wore to your 5th birthday party? You cried because it had a stain on it, and I told you nobody would notice, and you didn't believe me, and you sulked in the corner for 20 minutes until your father bribed you with cake. I did remember that dress. I hadn't thought about it in 20 years, hadn't thought about it since it happened. Actually, and yet the memory came rushing back whole and complete the second the voice mentioned it, like a door swinging open onto a room I'd forgotten existed. And I definitely, absolutely, had not told anyone that I had visited 3 thrift stores to find a boombox. I hadn't even told my best friend that specific detail. I had only said I'd found an old player somewhere. There was no way my mother could have recorded that information before she died. There was no way anyone could have known that unless they were watching me, right now in real time. My hands went cold. The tape clicked off again, exactly 10 minutes in. Same as before, the click sounding almost polite, like a door closing gently instead of slamming. I sat there panting in the dark, my heart slamming against my ribs. The things it said, they were true. All of them. Things I had never told a living soul. Things I was ashamed of. Things I had buried so deep, I barely admitted them to myself in the privacy of my own head. This wasn't a recording of my mother's love. This was something else wearing her voice like a mask, something that had access to the inside of my mind in a way that made my skin crawl to even think about. I threw the tape and the boombox into a garbage bag that night, tied it shut in 3 separate knots, and put it out on the curb before I could talk myself out of it. Part 6. It comes back 3 days later. I opened my apartment door to leave for work, and the garbage bag was sitting on my doorstep. I hadn't touched it. I had watched the garbage truck take it away myself, standing in my window with my morning coffee, feeling relieved as it disappeared down the street with a hydraulic groan, feeling, for the first time in days, like I could breathe normally again. But there it was. Same bag. Same 3 knots. Inside, the boombox and the tape, completely undamaged, like nothing had ever happened to them. No crushing, no compacting, not even a dent from the truck's mechanism. I should have thrown it in a river. I should have driven 2 hours out of town and left it in a dumpster behind a stranger's business, somewhere it could never trace back to my address. Looking back, I know that now. But something about finding it on my doorstep, untouched, waiting for me like a loyal dog that had somehow found its way home across an impossible distance, made me feel like fighting it was pointless. Like it had already decided I would listen again, and there was nothing I could do to stop that from happening eventually. Like this had already happened before to someone else, and the ending was already written. I carried the bag inside. I didn't unpack it right away. I let it sit in my closet for almost 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, strange things started happening around my apartment, small at first, then less small. I would wake up and find the bathroom mirror slightly fogged, like someone had just taken a hot shower, even though I lived alone and hadn't showered yet that day. I would hear, very faintly at the edge of sleep, a sound like a cassette tape rewinding, the little whirring clicks of the reels turning backward, coming from somewhere inside the walls, or maybe from inside my own skull. I genuinely couldn't tell anymore. Once, I found a single strand of gray hair on my pillow. My mother had gray hair, threaded through with white near the end. Mine is dark brown, no gray at all, not at 26. Another night, I woke at exactly 3:17 in the morning, a time that would come to matter very much later, to the smell of my mother's perfume filling my bedroom. So strong and so specific that for one half-asleep second, I genuinely believed she was standing at the foot of my bed. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding, and there was nothing there. Just the smell, fading slowly, like she had walked through the room seconds before I opened my eyes, and I had simply missed her by a heartbeat. I started sleeping with the lights on. I started avoiding my own apartment, staying late at work, going to my friend Priya's place instead of going home most nights. But apartments cost money, and eventually you have to go home. Part 7. Priya doesn't believe me until she does. I told Priya everything one night over wine at her kitchen table, half expecting her to tell me I needed therapy, which honestly might have been the correct response given how I sounded even to my own ears. Instead, she got very quiet. She set her glass down slowly, the way people do when they're deciding whether to say something they're not sure they should say. Her grandmother, she told me, used to tell a story about a haunted radio back in the old country, something that would speak in the voices of the dead and slowly reveal that it knew everything about the person listening. Her grandmother called a voice thief. She said the old stories warned that once it had your attention, it would try to get closer to you, learning more and more, until it knew you well enough to replace someone in your life, to slide into the shape of a person you loved, and wear that shape until nobody, including you, could tell the difference anymore. Part 10.5. Dr. Reyes. Around this time, my boss noticed I wasn't sleeping, noticed the dark circles under my eyes and the way my hand shook when I held my coffee cup, and she gently suggested I take some time and talk to someone. I made an appointment with a grief counselor named Dr. Reyes, a kind-faced woman in her 50s with a soft voice and an office full of houseplants that all looked suspiciously healthy for a room that saw so much crying. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't. I told her about my mother, about the funeral, about the exhaustion of clearing out a house full of someone else's whole life. I told her, carefully, in the most normal-sounding way I could manage, that I'd found an old recording of my mother's voice and that listening to it, it started to feel unsettling, that I sometimes felt like it knew things it shouldn't know. Dr. Reyes nodded slowly and told me, gently, that this was actually very common in grief. The mind is a pattern-making machine, she explained. It fills in gaps. It creates coincidences out of ordinary details because coincidence feels more bearable than randomness. And randomness is what death actually is, cold and without a plan. She said grief hallucinations were well documented. Hearing footsteps, smelling a parent's perfume, feeling a hand on your shoulder in an empty room. She said my mind might be doing something similar with the tape, hearing new details each time because I was, in a sense, listening for them, primed by loss to find meaning where there was only static and an old woman's tired, ordinary voice. It was a good explanation, a comforting one. For about 4 days, I let myself believe it completely, and those 4 days were the closest thing to peace I'd had since the funeral. Then Dr. Reyes called me herself 2 days after our second appointment, her voice strange and tight in a way it hadn't been in her office. She said she'd been having trouble sleeping since our session. She said she kept waking at 3:17 in the morning to the sound of her own baby monitor crackling with static, even though her children were grown and had moved out years ago and there was no monitor anywhere in her house anymore, hadn't been for over a decade. She asked me very carefully whether I had given anyone her name, her office number, anything at all that this thing, her word, not mine, though she said it like she didn't quite believe she was saying it, could have used to find her. I told her I hadn't. I don't think she believed me, and honestly, by then, I wasn't sure I believed myself either. She referred me to a colleague the following week and did not schedule another appointment. And when I called her office 2 months later, the receptionist told me, in a careful, professional voice, that Dr. Reyes was no longer taking new information about that matter, and please not to call again. I have not seen a therapist since. Part 11. When I found about Eleanor Voss, I went back to the library one more time, driven by something I couldn't fully name, so me to understand the shape of the thing that was hunting me before it finished doing whatever it was doing. I dug deeper into Eleanor Voss, cross-referencing old city directories, property records, anything the library's dusty archive could offer a woman with too much free time and too much fear driving her forward. I found out that Eleanor Voss had lived decades ago in a house 4 streets over from where my mother later bought her own home. I found a faded photograph of her in an old church newsletter, a woman in her 30s with dark, kind eyes, standing beside a daughter who looked to be about 10 years old. The caption named the daughter as Margaret. I found no further mention of Margaret anywhere in the archive after that single photograph. No school records, no wedding announcement, no obituary, nothing. As if a 10-year-old girl had simply stopped existing in any public record the moment that photograph was taken. I sat in that library for 3 hours, piecing together fragments, and the picture that emerged made my hands go cold in a way the air conditioning alone couldn't explain. A recording. A woman who became obsessed with it. Strange behavior escalating for months. A daughter who vanished from every record that came after. I don't know exactly what happened to Margaret Voss, and some final, self-protective part of me doesn't want to know. But I understood, sitting there under the library's flickering fluorescent lights, that I was not the first daughter this thing had ever spoken to in a dead woman's voice, and that whatever happened to Eleanor's daughter, it had happened after Eleanor stopped being able to tell the difference between her real mother's memory and the thing wearing it. I don't think this creature is new. I think it is old, patient, and it has done this before in other houses, wearing other mothers, other fathers, maybe other beloved dead, feeding slowly on grief and every private, unspoken thing a grieving person hands over without meaning to. I think it collects daughters the way some people collect stamps, unhurried, careful, one at a time, across decades, across towns, waiting each time for someone lonely enough and loving enough to press play. Part 12. Where I am now, it has been 3 months since I found that wooden box in the attic. I moved apartments twice. I changed my phone number twice as well, though the calls still find me somehow, arriving at numbers I've had for less than a week. I threw away every radio, every speaker, every device in my home capable of producing a voice. I don't own a smart speaker. I don't own a car with a radio. I can't physically disconnect. I had a mechanic rip the entire stereo system out of my dashboard, and he looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I insisted, and maybe I had a little by then. I unplugged my microwave and bought a new one without a clock function, without any digital display at all, the plainest, dumbest appliance the store had in stock. For a while, it seemed to work. Weeks went by in silence. I started to believe, cautiously, carefully, the way you test weight on a bridge you're not sure will hold, that maybe destroying the physical tape had actually weakened it, that it needed some kind of anchor, and I had taken that away by burning it down to ash. But 2 nights ago, my phone rang at 3:17 in the morning. The screen showed no caller ID, just a blank gray box where a name or number should be, glowing in the dark like something patient and awake. I didn't answer. It rang again the next night, and the next. I haven't answered. I don't intend to. But last night, for the first time, it didn't just ring. It left a voicemail, even though I never picked up, even though the call showed as missed on my screen the entire time, the little red one appearing beside the voicemail icon like a wound that had opened on its own. The voicemail is 11 seconds long. I haven't listened to it. I don't think I ever will. Not because I don't want to hear her voice. God help me. Some nights I want that more than I want almost anything else in the world. But because I finally understand what listening actually costs. Every time I let that voice in, it doesn't just speak to me. It learns me. It gets a little closer, a little more solid, a little more like the shape of the woman I lost. Until one day, I'm afraid there won't be a difference left to notice, and I'll have handed over the last of my mother's memory to something that was never her at all. I keep the phone in a drawer now, face down, the little red notification bubble sitting there in the dark like a small red eye that never blinks and never closes. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I find myself standing in front of that drawer anyway, my hand resting on the wood, wondering how close it has gotten by now, wondering how much more it has learned since I stopped listening on purpose, wondering if someday I'll get so lonely, so exhausted, so desperate to hear my mother's voice one more time, that I'll finally open that drawer, pick up the phone, and press play. If you ever find an old cassette tape that belonged to someone who died, and there's no label on it, and it feels too clean for how old it looks, please don't press play. Whatever voice comes out of it might sound exactly like the person you lost. It might say all the right things, know all the right memories, comfort you in exactly the way you need to be comforted, in a voice so perfect and so warm that every instinct in your body will tell you it's safe. But it isn't them. And every single time you listen, it gets a little closer to becoming whoever it wants to be. My phone is ringing right now as I finish telling you this. 3:17 in the morning. No caller ID. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to answer.